the election of Jeremy Corbyn this summer is an illustration of a radical shift within a very significant section of the population. After all, this is one of the oldest workers' parties in the world, and has suddenly been transformed. And it's not like they're making out on television that this is like a throwback to the 1980s. This is the most radical Labour leader since Keir Hardie, the founder of the Labour Party itself. That's what's happened in Britain. There's been a fundamental transformation in the balance of political power on the left. And the consequence of that, look at what happened this week during the Conservative Party conference. All these people were saying, before Jeremy Corbyn was elected, that if he's elected, his policies are impossible, no one can ever support them, and so on and so forth. But the moment Jeremy Corbyn was elected, the Conservative Party started to adopt policies from Jeremy Corbyn's proposals. So, for example, this week at their party conference, they announced an infrastructure development project. They poached this guy called Lord Adonis, who was a Labour Party expert on the field. And okay, it's not 25 billion investment programme like Jeremy Corbyn advocated, but it's a 5 billion investment programme in infrastructure. That is a consequence, a positive consequence, of Jeremy Corbyn's election as Labour leader.
No, that was in the
on
Labour
the
manifesto.
Syria vote.
That was in the Labour manifesto.
Yes, but Corbyn put forward a 25 billion programme of infrastructure investment, and they had no reason to adopt it had Corbyn not been elected as leader of the Labour Party.
I agree with that.
In relation to Syria, the discussion about Syria, the Conservatives said, well, they're playing on the fact there's disputes inside the Labour Party, parliamentary party about it. But on the Syria vote, let's be quite clear. Jeremy Corbyn is likely to scupper any vote on invasion, on bombing of Syria, just as well.
How's he going to do that?
Because they will feel they need all party support in order to do
But
that.
with respect to how
I
he
believe,
hasn't.
we will see. I believe.
Well, we already have seen.
What
Look,
have we seen?
a drone went over Syria and killed two.
Yes,
English-
okay, these drones will be going for some time now.
Well, that is
we know that. We know
that is
that.
bombing of Syria.
Well, that's a slightly different issue.
How is he going to rein those 50 MPs in?
Well, the 50 MPs may do what they want to do.
Yeah,
but I don't believe that will give the government sufficient confidence to go to war in Syria in circumstances that I could be wrong. Maybe the Conservative Party will do. But a primary calculation in the game now is how Jeremy Corbyn reacts to it. Because if Jeremy Corbyn is leading a campaign on the streets against a war in Syria and Iraq, of course, then I believe that will be a far bigger threat to the Conservative Party's policies. What if they mess up? As we have done in all the previous wars in recent time. Let's not forget, the reason we have a crisis in Syria is because of the war in Iraq. The war in Iraq was an outright failure.
Was it?
Yes, it was.
How do you know it's not some kind of part of the American century?
Well,
I mean,
we've been
it
told
looks
this
too easy.
endlessly about how smart the Americans are, how they plan everything, how they think it all through, how they plot everything, how there's some grand scheme to take over the world, which Barack Obama and George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan and a cabal of Bilderberg conspiracists have cooked up and orchestrated. I don't believe a word of it. I think they are less competent than most people imagine. They are less capable than most people imagine. That explains their failure to win in Afghanistan, their failure to win in Iraq, and consequently them being driven out at the moment by the Russians from Syria. By the Russians from Syria.
Wait a minute, hold a second. But the Afghan situation has always been like that since the Great Invasion in the 19th century. It's always been one of the most...
Britain has invaded Afghanistan 4 times in 150 years.
So it's a difficult...
4 times in 150 years. And on every single occasion, the British were defeated. The Russians went, yes, they went once.
Yeah.
The British went 4 times. 4 times. I had a couple of Conservatives came up to me earlier on, and they were very adamant that, of course, Corbyn's ideas can't work, and socialism can't work, and so on and so forth. But the problem is this. is that the system of capitalism, a society dominated by a tiny handful of companies, monopolistic companies that do not practice free market activity as they preach to people, but impose across the world by military force where they feel they're capable, their ideas, their practices, their power on the people of former colonial countries, thinking with arrogance that we live in the 19th century, where we can still go around and bombard around the world. And these idiots scream and shout when Jeremy Corbyn explains that NATO's purpose was to challenge the Soviet Union and should have been abolished at the end of the Cold War. The Trident missile is not a weapon that defends us against enemies like Russia or Syria. And by the way, the danger in Syria comes from kids from Luton, comes from kids from Queen's Park, comes from kids from Ladbroke Grove, who inspired by, in a negative sense, by the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Libya, that those people decide to risk their lives by going to the Middle East and fighting against British and American forces. 10% of the IIS forces or ISIL forces at the beginning, when they first emerged on the newspapers and television in their campaign to seize Baghdad, 10% of the armed forces of ISIL came from Britain. And many of them from America or Russia or other countries, coalescing together as a result of the failure of the Americans and the British to get support inside the country that they occupied, invaded, installed the government, controlled the army, controlled the political process, and still, rather than get what they want in Iraq, pro-Iranian forces are in power in Iraq. The worst nightmare of the Americans in the first place was Iran. Iraq was an ally compared with Iran. Now we make deals with Iran. The Iranians are the dominant influence in Iraq, and ISIL forces are marching across the region. That is what they achieved with their war in Iraq in 2003 up until today. So this nonsense about knowing what they're doing, planning what they're doing, achieving what they're doing, it's an absolute lie from beginning to end. And when that idiot, David Cameron, turns around and says, I will fire the nuclear bomb, it's idiocy. It's absolute and complete idiocy. Because when Corbyn says, I won't fire the bomb even if you tell me to, it's an honest politician saying what he believes. Why should these people seem to be lunatics? I looked on the newspaper or the internet this morning. They got a picture there. Oh my God, Jeremy Corbyn decided to go and eat fish and chips in Scotland rather than bow down and kiss the Queen's bottom. Now, apparently Jeremy Corbyn was terrible a couple of weeks ago because he didn't sing the national anthem at a Battle of Britain event. And the newspapers are screaming and shouting, Jeremy Corbyn this, Jeremy Corbyn that, terrorist sympathiser, doesn't support Britain, doesn't back for Britain, doesn't scream Britain every 2 minutes, doesn't wave the Union Jack Union Jack every few seconds. And yet, 2 weeks ago, a newspaper, the Times newspaper on Sunday, published an article in which a serving general in the British Army declared that if Jeremy Corbyn is elected leader of the country, the Prime Minister of Britain, the army will organise a mutiny and a coup d'etat against the elected government in Britain.
That's rubbish.
And yet, that's what he said.
That's bollocks.
That's what he said.
I'm in the army. I was in the army.
But you weren't in the General Staff, my friend.
Yeah, that's his.
Yeah, so what?
Yeah,
So what matters is what the NCOs say.
It was not named. It was not named.
It's bollocks, and no one's going to do
However, the Ministry of Defence issued a statement stating that this type of talk is unacceptable.
It's treason.
Indicating
It's
what
treason.
actually, I thought my first response was to write something on Facebook,
No, he's
as
a
you
traitor.
do,
He's
and I said treason. Then I looked up the law on treason. And actually, to be fair, according to British law, it's not treason what he said.
You can't take the Sunday Times very seriously.
I don't believe they would be likely to be able to achieve their objective of overthrowing an elected government, because the mass of people by that time should be aware and conscious of what is happening in society and able to intervene. What is a military coup? A military coup means you seize Downing Street, you send the army to Parliament, you use basically the headquarters of the Ministry of Defence on Whitehall as the headquarters of the state, declare a national emergency, get the Queen to abolish the government. If they were to seize these buildings, what would the response of the population be? You don't think the London population would come out on the streets in their tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions to bring back the government that they elected? Of course they would. And therefore, and even Conservative voters would come on the streets supporting Corbyn. And so the danger is, from the part of the elite, that they will overplay their hand and therefore undermine this Conservative Party that now claims to be the representative of working people. Working people, they say. Making generalised cuts to the welfare state. Those cuts will affect millions and millions of people. The austerity in Britain has been talked about for years on end, has not yet been carried out on a large scale. Over the next 3 and 4 years, the Conservatives will lose their base of support. And the movement behind the Corbyn campaign, which is not about members of Parliament, it's not about Jeremy Corbyn becoming leader, it's about transforming the balance of power in society towards the mass of people, so that people in their workplaces, in their communities, in their colleges and schools, in the institutions of the state, participate and take control of the running of the resources of society for the benefit of the general population within society. With our priorities, set the general priorities in society: healthcare, education, employment, leisure, reducing the working week, reducing the age at which we retire, improving the lives of the people. With every advance in technology, science and culture, we should raise the living standard, raise the hopes of the next generation and the generation after into a vision, to create a vision of the future that we will ourselves forge and create by our brains and our hands, utilising our minds and our culture to advance society, to progress society, not only in Britain but across the entire world. We must transform Britain from a country known for its imperial conquest of the world, for its 1/5 of the planet that 60 years ago we owned and controlled. Instead of this, we must transform Britain into the most open, the most democratic, the most participatory, democratic society, open to the entire planet, a genuine multicultural haven of human existence, showing our ability to live collectively in communities with diversity as an illustration to the entire planet as to how humanity can live, consciously plan and organise lives for the benefit of the majority, for peace, freedom and plenty, in harmony with the ecology, so that the economy and the institutions which govern society are made to serve the needs. That, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to join the Labour Party. Get involved in the campaign momentum. We have a meeting on Friday in the Paddington Arts Centre, 7 p.m. Friday, Paddington Arts Centre, where we will be launching a campaign to transform the housing crisis in Britain into a plan to develop housing, refurbishment, rent controls and provision of social facilities across the entire country, organising people in their communities to transform the housing question in Britain so that housing serves the needs of the people, not just the interests of profitability.
So, is this a pro-democracy movement then, is it?
Yes, it's a movement to establish mass democratic control over the resources in society. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. Join up the Labour Party, take a leaflet here on our walking tour. Yes, one question.
One person attracts somebody else, that's double the number. They attract two more, that's double the number again, and that's how movements grow.